Hi, this is Chris with LaunchCode, and this video is going to introduce a new concept called model binding, which is a really handy tool to streamline your code and just make things generally easy for you when working with Spring Boot in an MVC application. So what we'll do is we're going to refactor this method, process create event form, which this method is the handler that gets called when someone submits the form to create a new event, and that form contains two fields, a name and a description. And so model binding, what the advantage it's going to give us is once we implement it, we'll see how this works. But basically, now you have to refer to every single piece of data for an event that you want to create explicitly in the list of parameters for this method. So we have an event name, an event description. Say we wanted to add a contact email for the organizer of the event. We would have to add another request param, and that quickly gets out of hand and quickly gets unwieldy. And so model binding will allow us to streamline that so we don't have to have such a long list of parameters. It's also going to enable, as we'll learn in a future lesson, it's going to enable validation of model fields. So we're going to be able to do server-side form validation and make sure that the data we're storing in our application is correct. So the way this works is I can replace this parameter list with a single parameter, and that's going to be an event object called new event. And I can enable this by adding the model attribute annotation. So this is the key piece of model binding. What this does is when Spring tries to call this method, when a post request is made to this route, it will look in the request data and look for fields that match up with the fields of the event class. So our event class, if we can remind ourselves, currently has a name field and a description field. It will look for parameters in the request that have those exact same identifiers, that have name or description. And upon finding those identifiers, it will create an event object and populate its fields with those values. In other words, this thing we're doing right here, where we're creating a new event with calling the constructor with the values of the parameters that are passed in, we are now basically enabling Spring to do that for us. So I can wipe out this entire constructor call and just say add new event. Okay, so that looks much better, much more clean than our previous implementation of this method. So just to reiterate, when this method is called, Spring will create the new event object for us, given the name and description values that are in the request. So the last thing we need to do to tie this all together is we need to go back to our form and make sure that the name of the form inputs match up with the names of the fields in this class, which they currently, I suspect, do not. So we'll go to our form here, and we've got our two inputs. This one's called event name. I need to now change that to just name, and this one to just description. And the reason I do that is these have to match the field names of the event object right here. So these have to match up. Otherwise, Spring won't know how to assign the properties of this event object when it gets created. Okay, so that should be all we have to do. And let's restart our application and see how this works. So aside from making our code cleaner, as I mentioned, model binding is going to become very important for us in a future lesson when we talk about validating our data. So it'll be really, really handy at that point. So refresh our application. I'm going to create an event. Oof, rough day with the spelling. All right, so we have an event there. Notice that it was created correctly. In other words, that's what we just were working on. That actually did work the way it was expected to work, which is nice. We just refactored our application. We made our code cleaner, and we put in some functionality that's going to be really, really handy when we look to validating our model data.